Thank you so much, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Power to Fly, for this awesome experience. Dr. Rónké, I'm so excited to interview you today. I just want to say the stars have aligned, and I'm super excited to dive into the next 30 minutes here. That it's going to go by super quickly, you're going to see. So I know we've got a lot of live listeners, and I just want to make sure everyone knows we would love to hear from you. So as I ask these questions that are coming from my personal, my personal experience and my journey to Dr. Rónké here. I would love to hear from you. So please drop your questions in the chat box and we'll leave some time at the end to hear from you. But let's just start off. I would just love for you to let us know a little bit more about yourself, your role, and any fun facts you'd like to kick us off with.
Okay, yes. I hope everyone can hear me. Again, I would like to thank Power to Fly for this opportunity, for this platform, and also for this summit, and also the work of Mariella to just kind of as my interlocutor in this moment. Thank you all for just your time and your support of Black women at this particular time in our history. As they said, they read my bio, so I will not rehearse it. But I will say that one of the things that I am particularly interested in, and you could see this trace not only through the work that I do, the organizations I support, my political commitments, and also my research and my teaching, is that I'm fundamentally interested in how we show up in this world and how we interact and also negotiate the spaces that we are literally tossed into in this world, and in particular, and as it pertains in particular to race, I'm interested in understanding how race gets created. So my interest in race and identity formation is not fully understanding it as a defined concept, but to understand how it's taken up within the space of the racial imaginary, the imagined ideas that we have about racialized bodies. And finally, one of the I think most interesting thing about me is that I am fundamentally interested in creating new resources and new avenues by which to do the work that we do. And this is what you see with the National Consortium of Diversity Practitioners. Fun, interesting facts. I'm currently writing a novel. I'm in the midst of writing a novel. It is a newish coming of age story about love. I love, love, love jigsaw puzzles, and I'm really into social deduction games like Mafia. Mafia is, I just enjoy Mafia. So those are some interesting facts about me, and I can't wait to dive into these questions.
Thank you so much. I'm totally looking forward to this novel. Just to kick us off, because I love philosophizing, so I love that you can, back me up on this. I love philosophizing, and I love speaking about the importance of emotional intelligence. And with that comes learning the B side of history, as I like to say in some of my live Q&As when I have the honor to speak with diverse women throughout the week on Power to Fly and pick their brains through live Q&As. So I love to, bring us back to the importance of emotional intelligence. There's a philosopher, actually, he's a historian, he's a historian from Israel. His name is Yuval Noah Harari. And I'm pretty much obsessed with the way that he philosophizes about, where we are going in the future according to what he has studied in the past. And I love that he's giving us the B side of history because he's coming from, a place that is not the States, it's not Silicon Valley, it's not Europe. And he's kind of, telling us one thing that we're great at doing as Homo sapiens is storytelling and creating fiction. So I love that you have that on your list, that you're, starting a novel and that you're rooting it in love. So what a great way to kick off this chat. But let's begin the session by understanding the difference between race, citizenship, and identity, and how these concepts influence how we understand ourselves.
Mhm. So thank you again for that question. And I think there are very technical definitions of these concepts. And so I'm trying to resist the urge to regurgitate and rehash these definitions, because I think part of what you want to know is how I approach it and how I think about these terms and the relationships and the relations between these terms. So I think that on a fundamental level, one way of thinking about these three terms terms is to understand that that identity is taken to be the umbrella category under which race and citizenship operate. Another way is to say that they are dimensions, one of many dimensions of the self. But I think that in particular to me and the the academic, the existential training and models that I draw from, I think that all three, identity, race, and citizenship, are existential modes. They're ways of existing and relating socially to the world around you. And I think that when I think about identity, what I'm thinking about fundamentally is this idea of showing up in the world, and how I think of myself in the world. And I talk about this in terms of identity in a way to kind of talk about or think through the singularity of self, to think of to kind of hold myself within one larger category. And so when I think about identity, I'm thinking about all the different methods and modes and ways of being and ways of articulating and expressing the self that I have to pull together and constrain under this singular term by which I think of identity. And I think that one of the other important questions that I tend to raise around identity, or something that I tend to, to kind of encourage as we explore and kind of expand our notions, our understandings of identity, is that identity is not a self-ascription, meaning that I don't just show up in the world and say that this is who I am and this is my identity. No, identity is a negotiation between the self and and others. So it's this social interaction. And so I think that a lot of people are a bit kind of misunderstand identity when they say that they could just express yourselves just freely. No, there's a world that takes you in, that there's a word that also reads you and renders you and places you within these fixed categories. And so identity is created, or it entails those ideas and those meanings. And race, as we know, are the predetermined ethnic categories that we fall into. But in the ways in which I understand it, and one of the things that you mentioned even in your opening, is that there's a certain type of logic and illogic, to race. And more and more, as I continue to learn and study, but also think about my relation to race, I am doing similar work as you are doing, in terms of thinking about what race means outside of just the US context. I always find that it's interesting when I talk about my research on race, and so I'm Nigerian. So when I go home to Nigeria and I talk about my research on race, people look at me as though I am crazy. They say that race doesn't exist in this space. And so to understand how we show up, and how as racialized bodies, as Black bodies, we show up in the world, kind of shows the expanse, but also the ways in which we could stretch the notions of race, which then leads us to citizenship. So I said that I'm originally from Nigeria, but I live, and my citizenship is in the United States. So citizenship is a way of kind of connecting us, or rooting us into a place. So citizenship, for me, the way in which I think about it, is just, again, about our relationship to space and place. And a lot of this, if you can, and a lot of this, and I think that we know that this is a highly contested term, given how citizenship and immigration rights show up in the world today. And so this is why I'm also particularly interested in thinking about this notion of a world citizen, which is what the concept of cosmopolitanism provides us. And which is why I then transition to kind of bridge race, citizenship, and identity together in order to think about this complex portmanteau Afropolitanism, as it captures the ways in which we show up as racialized bodies, our idea of citizenship that extends beyond borders, and it's marked by itinerant modes of self-being and self-expressing and mobilization. And it also talks about the ways in which identity we can't be enclosed by our identities, but our own sense of self expands the notions and the categories and the identity categories that we lay out. So these are the things that I'm constantly thinking about whenever those three terms are mentioned, that far exceed their standard definitions and the ways in which they're used.
Beautifully put. Makes me even more curious to just continue to follow what you're doing. Before I forget, how can folks, support the work that you're doing? When we end this conversation, I'm definitely curious to read some of your reflections and also to support the novel that you've got coming up. Just from hearing you speak from your perspective, I love that you're bringing this to a more global question, and also to kind of unpack it and make it less finite, less binary. So how can we find you? How can we support the work that you're doing?
So I have an article, if anyone is interested in my thoughts or also in my criticisms of Afropolitanism or Americana, I have a paper in the Critical Philosophy of Race journal called talking about traveling elsewhere. It's entitled Traveling Elsewhere. I'm currently working on a series of writings that talk more so about this notion of returning, this notions around citizenship, about our ability to return back to our African countries of origin. And if you want to find out more, I would suggest that you connect with me either through my Twitter account, which is Keen and Mean, or through LinkedIn. But the best way to connect with me is over Instagram at novel_lifestyle, at novel_lifestyle. If you go there and you click into the link in my bio, you'll actually have an opportunity to read an excerpt from the novel that I am writing. So please send me feedback as well.
I love that. I'm definitely going to stay connected with you when we finish this conversation. Super inspired. I received this question offline. I'm curious if you would love to, share a little bit more about your journey on a more personal level. What are the challenges you face as a Black woman philosopher in academia?
So we know all about the imposter syndrome and the feelings of tokenism, not only being, one in a few Black women philosophers. I think that there are now about maybe 55 or up to 60 of us in the nationally. There's a very small section of Black women philosophers that I'm now a part of, and so to do that and to also kind of come from the African context, there is an element of tokenism that is at play and that functions. But I think that for me, what some of the challenges was this that I faced as a Black woman philosopher in academia was to primarily this idea that we had to learn the white canon before we interrogate and learn and challenge and learn our own history, that we had to be proficient in Kant and in Hegel before we understood the Black feminist philosophers and scholars, and even the African scholars whose theories kind of impact the way in which we think, we live our lives, and we understand ourselves in this world. And I think that, if I could identify a couple of other challenges, it's also, philosophy is a very abstract field. And one of the things that was exceptionally challenging was this idea of being pragmatic and thinking about the practical implications of the theories that you have. So you're often kind of in this thought vacuum when you're creating these ideas and these theories. But as you can tell from the overview of my story and my bio that was presented, that I'm constantly thinking about who my work impacts and who my work speaks to, speaks for, and gives, and the experiences that it gives voice to. So it was a challenge to kind of just think that I had a career outside of academia, that I could do this work outside of academia, and that I could and that my work can have a practical angle, or that it could be centered practically, but operate theoretically. And in addition to just developing a general writing complex, I used to describe myself as a writer who doesn't write. because of just the difficulties and the challenges in terms of speaking on your, in your own voice that you develop in graduate school. And I know that people who have experienced this in academia have also shared this experience, that one of the things that they had to kind of break themselves away from is this idea that they wrote as though they were a white male. So to kind of actually write as a Black woman or within the identity categories that you inhabit was something that was a challenge that I had to work very difficult and very hard to overcome.
Wow, there's so much to unpack in everything that you're saying. First of all, thank you so much for sharing, that personal bit about your journey. And I'm sure you're not alone, and that we have a lot of work to do. And these talks hopefully will get us closer to a more balanced place where we can accept everyone and not have to look through one kind of lens. So interesting that you're bringing that up, because I don't know if you're familiar with The Social Dilemma. There are some new documentaries that are coming out for people to see what's happening in the world of technology. And I love that you can philosophize on this a little bit, because I love to speak about emotional intelligence, like I mentioned, and inclusive community in the workplace. And what we're finding is that, because a lot of, a lot of teams in the world of technology aren't diverse or aren't inclusive, you have the same story being told. Essentially, digital colonization is happening. So I could interview a woman the other day who is from Kenya. Sylvia Mukasa is her name, and the chat was surrounded on this topic, that is, can technology be discriminatory and unfair? Short answer is yes. Why? Because you have a certain kind of person creating artificial intelligence. So I just wanted to let everyone know, to just be more responsible in this, as we are building, technology together. And I want to get your opinion just on, how the world of technology is not leaving space for philosophy to happen. And so we're running into, a technology that is basically learning from the biases that we already have, whether they be conscious or unconscious. So there's a new documentary coming out called Coded Bias, and it speaks about. Have you heard of it? Okay, so it speaks about this lab researcher at MIT, when she discovered that certain facial recognitions do not see dark-skinned faces and women accurately, and trying to find petition for legislation to happen in the U.S. at least, so that these algorithms aren't impacting our life. So this question comes more from the social and global impact of artificial intelligence. What can we, as consumers of technology, do to prevent technology from being discriminatory, or which technologies should we avoid, in your opinion?
So I think that it's fascinating to me, just the kind of the broad way in which we use or think of technology, right? So technology can be as broad as the artificial intelligence, but it could also be as simple as any kind of assistive device. So when you're thinking about the challenges and the kind of the disparities, but also the racism within the technologies, we're thinking about technologies in this very expansive way. I remember I was just having a conversation with someone around this issue, and I brought up coded bias as a recommendation. And I was just talking about even the simplicity of just going into the bathroom and washing my hands, and just the automated, any kind of automated device that doesn't recognize the darker complexion, right? So when I stick my hands under the water, it doesn't necessarily respond to me in the same way as those facial recognition devices misread and mischaracterize us. So I think that part of it is to kind of first understand and identify the ways in which we are excluded from this conversation, and to understand that we have certain types of knowledges and capabilities and expertise that we can lend to reimagining and reinventing these devices. So whereas we do see, and we're starting to see, a lot of the ways in which technology goes wrong, there's still a lot of creative potential to where we can reimagine and reconfigure these in order to be more productive for our communities. The thing that you mentioned that I think is also missing from this is that when we're talking about the ways in which the algorithms are also, also mistakenly are also racist. So it's the racist algorithms that are getting implanted into these technologies that are producing racist results. But it's also the ways in which they are used, right? So the uses of them and is already conceived within spaces and experiences that don't serve us. So we relate to space differently. We orient ourselves to experience differently. And so the ways in which these technologies are also working in order to normalize certain types of maneuvers and ways that we are moving and operating in the world is also a part of or aspect of these conversations that we have to consider. And my favorite example, since we're giving examples, is something that people are still believe that this didn't happen. But there was a time where you Googled Black woman into a Google search. You just typed in the search bar Black women, and I think animals, like I think it was like a lion or an animal just started to populate. And that was my first exposure to this problem. And so I think that drawing attention to it is one thing. Being involved in the processes of creating it is another thing. And then the third layer is just to kind of simply just think about the ways in which our own experience in relation to these devices often also have to shift when we're thinking about how to incorporate them and how to use these technologies.
Yes, beautifully said. I know I wanted to dive deep there, so thank you for diving deep with me. I know that you can say so much more about that, but for the sake of time, can we bring it back to the creators of the technology? So I asked you about how can we be conscious consumers? How can we be conscious producers? So this question, coming back to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which a couple years ago, this wasn't even a thing that existed. So I would love for you to talk about that as well. Why do you see this being a hot topic now? How can we really do it justice and not just have it be a trending thing? And then if you could touch on this question, while working in the tech industry, how can we make sure the product we're helping to build will not be discriminatory?
Now that is a simple question, and we see that is a very difficult question with a simple answer, and something that we've seen. Even if we look at the types of fashions and the fashion faux pas and that we have seen, is to have people in the room. Having to allow them to have a seat at the table is one of the kind of fundamental things that we can do to make sure that these types of gross violent occurrences do not happen, instances do not happen. And I think that making sure that the right people are in the right room making the decisions also is an aspect of that would go far to help this situation. And I think that when you're talking about the history of diversity and equity, inclusion, and belonging, so belonging is now the new buzzword. So my title includes belonging, and belonging, as I've described it, is about work culture. But the way in which I think about it is about the systems and the structures that hold up the very idea, the very terms in terms of who gets to show up in the room, who gets to have a say, and who gets to make decisions. So belonging is about how it feels to be in the space, but that feeling is created by the systems, by the structures, by the circumstances. So belonging is now the new buzzword, and I see it, expanding into justice. We've already seen areas that talk about accessibilities. So this, as you pointed out, is an ever expanding field. We know that in the 1990s is really when the diversity became a buzzword or became infused within the corporate spaces. And it wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s when this space endured a shift. And the shift came through higher education institutions being introduced into being made part of this conversation. And I think that is an important shift because it not only shifted to kind of representation, but it's shifted to kind of thinking about more inclusive theories that surround and that can participate, and also move the language away from just thinking about management to thinking about leadership, to thinking about capacities, to think about justice, to thinking about all of these things that we are now thinking about in this space. And I think that the shift is interesting because it shows us the role that academics have in this work that we do. And I know that more and more academics are being asked and even tasked with producing the theories, the ideas that uphold the actions and the practices that we see within the DEIB space. So it's been important to me to not only provide resources and avenues for people who are entering in these space, for seasoned diversity practitioners, but to also provide a supportive network for those who are doing this work, and especially to encourage more academics to get involved in having these conversations and taking up these spaces, and to consider this as a very important space in which to kind of enact your academic training.
I love that. I love that response, and so that gives me hope. Hopefully, more folks in that in the educational space will, feel more confident and support you in your call out here. So thank you for that. We've got just a couple more minutes left, and I just want to hold you on the idea of belonging. So, how can the world of, let's talk about sponsorships or venture capitalism. I'd love to just hear your comment on an article from Urban Geeks, which I love their title, their motto. It says, "Making tech more colorful, accessible, and diverse." So I'm just going to quote them. "The overwhelming majority of VCs continue to invest in younger versions of themselves. In fact, most venture-backed startups are overwhelmingly white, male, Ivy League educated, and based in Silicon Valley, according to a recent study conducted jointly by Diversity VC and Rate My Investor." So despite the growing fact that Black and Latinx women are the fastest growing sector of entrepreneurs, they are still not being supported essentially through this economy. So how can we solve this problem?
And one of the things that I like to do, and when I hear about these articles, is to kind of push back to against these ideas that this idea that they aren't being supported. They aren't being supported in these very traditional spaces. And I think that part of your point is that these traditional ways of funding and supporting organizations and amassing wealth and obtaining capital matter significantly. But I also want to say that there are other mechanisms and resources that exist within the very communities that these Black and brown entrepreneurs exist in, that support and uphold and sustain these organizations. And and I can run through a few examples, but given that we are short on time, I'm going to say that there are other avenues and other ways of support that exist. And so when I said earlier that we have to think about the ways in which we experience, and that this experience and what we're doing within our communities matter, and they shape how we're thinking about success, how we're viewing capital, how we're viewing entrepreneurship, those things are integral to kind of shifting the way and the language by which we're using and thinking through this matter as well. And so to draw on those experiences as a way to kind of push back and to respond to these articles who are saying things that just are just the tip of the iceberg when you're thinking about the full experience of support that we have for our communities.
Yes, and I know that you have so much more to say about that. So for the sake of time, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your voice. And then how can we support the work that you're doing? Remind us, just in case folks need to write that down again. I got some private questions here about your Instagram and any website or avenue that we can support you.
Yes, so the website is coming, but you can follow me on Instagram. I think that space has the most information, and it is novel_lifestyle. So novel, NOVEL_lifestyle on Instagram.
Awesome. This has been such a beautiful chat, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you a little more
Yes.
offline. So thank you for your time. And Nicole, will pass the mic back to you.